The Young and the Restless. Spoilers. Victor Newman was never a man who allowed his empire to collapse quietly. If anything, the closer he came to the edge, the more dangerous he became. He knew better than anyone that some of his recent moves had been reckless, driven less by strategy and more by pride. By the familiar belief that sheer force of will could still bend the world back into alignment. Yet acknowledging missteps did not weaken Victor Newman, it sharpened him. Retreat was not in his nature, counterattack was. And this time, his weapon of choice was not brute financial muscle or public intimidation, but a man standing at the intersection of loyalty, ambition, and unresolved resentment, Cain Ashby. Victor's decision to pull Cain into his orbit was both calculated and controversial, even by Newman's standards. Cain represented opportunity precisely because he was underestimated, because he carried scars from past alliances that had left him wary but not broken. Victor understood this instinctively. He saw in Cain not just a pawn, but a catalyst, someone whose involvement would fracture existing alliances, stir old suspicions, and redirect attention away from Victor himself. It was a bold gamble, one that assumed Cain's hunger for relevance and redemption could be harnessed without igniting consequences Victor could no longer control. Victor did not fear the chaos this plan would unleash, he relied on it. Disorder, after all, was often where he thrived. But as always, Victor's strategies carried a cost, and that cost was paid first within his own family. The mere mention of Cain's name in the context of a Newman operation was enough to reopen wounds that had never fully healed. Trust, already fragile, splintered further. Victor demanded unity, yet offered little reassurance beyond his own certainty. He expected faith without transparency, obedience without explanation, and loyalty without guarantees. To Victor, this was the price of survival. To the rest of the Newmans, it felt like being dragged once again into a war they had not chosen. Nikki Newman sensed the danger immediately. She had lived through too many of Victor's battles to mistake bravado for invincibility. While Victor framed his plan as a necessary strike against encroaching enemies, Nikki saw the ripples spreading outward, threatening to pull in people who had never asked to be part of this fight. Her fear was not abstract. It had a name: Lily Winters. Nikki could see the pattern forming with unsettling clarity. Victor's maneuvers rarely remained contained, and when they spilled over, it was often the innocent or at least the less armored who suffered the most. Lily, already burdened by her own responsibilities and moral dilemmas, was drifting dangerously close to the storm's center. Nikki's concern went beyond maternal instinct or moral objection. It was rooted in experience. She knew Victor's wars did not end cleanly. They left reputations in ruins, relationships poisoned, and emotional casualties that no amount of financial compensation could erase. She warned Victor, not with hysteria, but with quiet urgency, reminding him that Lily was not built for this kind of ruthless chess game. Victor listened, but listening was not the same as yielding. In his mind, the board was already set, the pieces already in motion. To hesitate now would be to admit vulnerability, and Victor Newman did not survive decades at the top by allowing doubt to dictate his actions. What Victor underestimated, however, was not the resistance of his enemies, but the erosion of trust within his own ranks. He needed the Newmans to believe in his plan, to stand behind him not out of obligation, but conviction. Instead, he faced hesitation, second-guessing, and quiet defiance. Each skeptical glance, each unanswered question chipped away at the unified front Victor demanded. For the first time in a long while, authority alone was not enough to command allegiance. The family was tired of collateral damage, tired of being asked to sacrifice stability for the sake of Victor's endless wars. While the Newman household wrestled with internal conflict, their oldest rivals were watching closely. Jack Abbott and Diane Jenkins Abbott had learned long ago that Victor's moments of vulnerability were rare and fleeting. To hesitate was to miss the opportunity entirely. From their perspective, Victor's reliance on Cain was not a sign of strength, but desperation. It suggested a man running out of trusted options, forced to reach beyond his inner circle to maintain control. Jack and Diane recognized this as the opening they had been waiting for. Together, they prepared a decisive move, convinced that Victor was weaker now than he had been in years. Their plan was precise, informed by patience and long memory. This was not a reckless strike, but a calculated attempt to reclaim ground long dominated by Newman influence. Jack believed the moment had finally arrived when victory was not just possible, but deserved. Diane, ever strategic, saw the broader picture. This was not merely about defeating Victor, but reshaping the balance of power in Genoa City. For a brief moment, celebration felt inevitable. The thought of finally outmaneuvering Victor Newman carried a seductive thrill. Yet even as Jack and Diane advanced their agenda, cracks began to form from an unexpected direction. The younger generation, less bound by old vendettas and more attuned to shifting alliances, threatened to complicate everything. Kyle Abbott, caught between loyalty to his father and unresolved emotions of his own, became an unpredictable variable. His feelings for Claire Newman had never fully dissipated, lingering beneath the surface like an unhealed wound. Kyle's internal conflict made him vulnerable, and vulnerability in a power struggle was dangerous. Claire Newman, however, was not blind to the forces surrounding her. Intelligent and perceptive, she understood that survival in Genoa City required more than emotional awareness. It demanded information. Rather than allowing herself to be defined by Kyle's uncertainty or her family's expectations, Claire took initiative. She began quietly digging into Audra Charles, sensing that Audra held pieces of a puzzle no one else was fully examining. Claire's curiosity was not idle, it was strategic. Secrets were currency, and Claire intended to know their value before anyone else could use them against her. As Claire's investigation deepened, the lines between alliances blurred further. Holden, operating with motives that remained deliberately opaque, approached Claire not as an adversary, but as a potential ally. He sought her help, recognizing her access, her intelligence, and her growing independence from the rigid Newman narrative. This request placed Claire at a crossroads. Helping Holden could grant her leverage and insight, but it also risked entangling her in conflicts that extended far beyond personal loyalty. The decision she faced was not simply about whom to trust, but about who she was becoming. Meanwhile, Jack's insistence that Kyle join him in the battle against Victor placed father and son on opposite emotional trajectories. Jack framed the conflict as legacy, as duty, as the inevitable continuation of a war that defined their family. Kyle, however, felt the weight of a future that did not belong entirely to old grudges. Pulled between expectation and desire, strategy and emotion, he hesitated. That hesitation alone threatened to undermine Jack's carefully constructed plan. Across Genoa City, tensions rose as every move triggered unintended consequences. Victor's counterattack, meant to reassert dominance, instead exposed vulnerabilities that others were quick to exploit. Nikki's fears deepened as Lily edged closer to the fallout, her integrity tested by forces indifferent to personal cost. The Abbott's power play gained momentum, even as internal fractures threatened to sabotage their advantage. Claire's quiet investigation into Audra hinted at revelations that could shift alliances overnight, while Holden's request positioned her as a potential kingmaker in a game she never asked to play. And at the center of it all stood Victor Newman, unyielding, defiant, and increasingly isolated. He had always believed that control was synonymous with strength, that commanding the board meant owning every outcome. Yet for the first time, the pieces were moving in ways even he could not fully predict. Allies questioned him, enemies anticipated him. And the younger generation, once content to orbit his gravity, began to chart paths of their own. The warning implicit in the chaos was clear, though Victor refused to acknowledge it outright. Power, once absolute, was no longer guaranteed. The empire still stood, but its foundations were trembling, not from external attack alone, but from the accumulated weight of mistrust, ambition, and unresolved consequence. As Victor prepared his next move, convinced that force and foresight would once again carry him through, the question was no longer whether someone would challenge him but whether this time the damage would be irreversible, and whether the very people he sought to protect would be the ones left standing when the dust finally settled. Tessa Porter had always believed that love, if held tightly enough, could keep a person from breaking apart, but as she watched Sharon Collins struggle to process the truth, she realized there were fractures that had been forming for far longer than anyone wanted to admit. Bringing the truth into the light felt less like an act of betrayal and more like ripping away a bandage that had been hiding a wound that was already infected. Tessa had forced herself to say the words out loud, to look Sharon in the eye, and pushed past every instinct that begged her to stay silent. Mariah Copeland was the one who had taken Dominic from Abby Newman and Devin Hamilton Winters. It was Mariah who had crossed a line no one wanted to imagine she was capable of crossing, and yet, when the admission sank in, it did not feel like a sudden transformation. It felt like the culmination of months, maybe years, of unresolved pain, loneliness, and vulnerability that had finally found an outlet in something unthinkable. Sharon's face had gone pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if the world itself were tilting beneath her feet. Because to accept what Tessa was saying meant accepting that her child had become both victim and perpetrator. It was not just the act of kidnapping that shocked Sharon, it was realizing how deeply she had underestimated the darkness pressing in around her daughter. And how blind she had been to the influence of Ian Ward until it was too late. The weight of that realization sat heavily over everyone connected to the baby. Abby's grief had never really had a chance to settle into something stable. From the moment she discovered Dominic was missing, her world became a blurred loop of panicked phone calls, frantic searches, sleepless nights, and cold, empty spaces where laughter should have been. She kept replaying every interaction she had recently had with Mariah, looking for a hint of what was coming, for a tremor in Mariah's voice, or a hollow look in her eyes that might have warned her. But the past refused to rewrite itself, and no amount of retrospection could undo the moment Mariah made the decision to leave with Dominic. Devin, meanwhile, carried his own suffering differently. He had always seen himself as a steady anchor, someone who could absorb crisis and still find a way to function. But this loss struck at a primal place inside him, a part that had already been shaped by abandonment and death, and the constant threat of losing the people he loved. Dominic was not just a child to him, he was proof that some broken histories could be rewritten. To have that fragile hope ripped away without explanation felt like a cruel joke played by fate. Together, Abby and Devin stood in the center of a trauma they could neither fully comprehend nor escape, and in their desperation, they turned to a source of help that neither of them would have considered under normal circumstances. Seeking Sharon's help was not an obvious choice. On paper, it made no sense to approach the mother of the person who had taken their child and ask her to intervene. It felt like placing their hope in the hands of someone who had already failed to see the danger. Yet, beneath the logic and the anger, there was something instinctive about the decision. Sharon understood Mariah in ways no one else did, and she had history with Ian Ward that went beyond rumors and police files. She knew, from bitter personal experience, what it felt like to be pulled into his orbit, how persuasive and insidious he could be. Abby and Devin arrived at Sharon's door not with accusations, but with a kind of broken pleading, a silent demand that she use whatever connection she still had with Mariah to bring Dominic home. It was a plea wrapped in resentment, because while they needed Sharon, they also could not forgive the fact that this nightmare had a direct line back to her family. Sharon listened, carrying all that guilt like a physical burden, understanding that no matter how responsibly she acted now, she would always be haunted by the question of whether she had missed something she should have seen. Tessa watched the three of them, feeling as if she were standing on a thin strip of land between collapsing cliffs. Her loyalties were shredded. She loved Mariah, deeply and fiercely, and part of her wanted to cling to the belief that this whole situation was some kind of misunderstanding. That there was a rational explanation that would make sense once they found Mariah and heard her side of the story. But Tessa could not unsee the pattern in Mariah's increasingly distant behavior, her fixation on Dominic, the way she spoke about him as if he were the only thing tethering her to the world. Tessa had tried gently redirecting, had tried suggesting therapy, time away, grounding routines. None of it had pierced whatever hold Ian Ward had reestablished over her. When she finally confirmed what her instincts had already whispered, that Mariah had taken Dominic intentionally and had no intention of returning him, Tessa knew denial was no longer an option. Choosing to expose Mariah's actions to Sharon, Abby, and Devin meant accepting that she might lose the person she loved, but allowing this to continue meant risking something much worse. A child growing up inside a prison built from someone else's trauma. Far away from the moral debates and emotional implosions, Mariah moved with the rigid focus of someone who had convinced herself that this was the only way to keep everyone safe. Part of her still remembered the warmth of holding Dominic in her arms for the first time. The strange combination of terror and tenderness that had swept over her when she realized that this tiny life had been entrusted to her, if only for a while. At first, her love for him had felt like a natural extension of her role, a temporary but sacred duty. But somewhere along the way, that love had been twisted into something else, something obsessive and tightly wound around her sense of self-worth. The more she heard Ian's voice, whether in reality or in the echo of his psychic hold over her, the more she began to believe that Dominic needed her in a way no one else understood. Ian was adept at pressing on fractures that already existed, tapping into Mariah's long-standing fear of being disposable, of being left behind once her usefulness was exhausted. He reframed her bond with Dominic as a calling, a mission, whispering that the world around them was poisoned by power, ego, and selfishness, and that only someone like Mariah, someone who had been broken and rebuilt, could truly protect the child. Under his influence, every attempt by others to reach out felt like a threat. Ian fed her a perverse narrative in which Abby and Devon were not parents grieving the loss of their son, but dangerous figures eager to pull Dominic into a cycle of privilege and corruption. He framed Tessa's concern as weakness, a sign that she did not have the stomach for the kind of hard choices the world required. He painted Sharon as compromised, someone whose past with him had left her incapable of seeing the truth. When Mariah hesitated, he did not shout or coerce in obvious ways. He simply reminded her of every moment she had felt and seen, and chosen, or secondary. He reminded her of the pain she had carried from her own upbringing, the instability, the searching for a place to belong. Then he juxtaposed that with the image of Dominic sleeping peacefully in her arms, safe and untouched by the machinations of Genoa City. In that comparison, the moral lines blurred until Mariah could no longer differentiate between protecting Dominic and protecting herself.